From Metal Gear Solid all the way to The Last of Us, games have been creating worlds with hazardous conditions that characters must trudge through with the use of gas masks. As games often do with technology, tools, and weapons, however, many of the finer details of how these things work get lost in the mix, as games focus more and more on seeming realistic instead of being so. This is understandable to a point, as gameplay and fun factor will always matter more than technical minutiae and realistic nuance in games and movies. But even still, as these finer details fall through the cracks, it's interesting to notice that they are doing so, if for nothing else than just to keep our own heads on straight about how these things really work, in the off chance that we ever actually have to use them. Gas masks are generally reserved for protecting the user from inhaling dangerous particles in the air, whether that be biological agents like viruses or bacteria, or man-made chemicals of war like chlorine or mustard gas. Putting them on must be done before entering an area with hazardous air quality. This is something that seems obvious, and it is, but despite that, many games seem to be missing it. Just about every game where gas masks are used, your character can enter an area with smoke, gas, or whatever hazards in the air and equip the mask after the fact. The main problem with this is that once you put the mask on, the negative pressure that creates the airtight seal does not automatically expel the bad air that you've just trapped between your face and the interior of the mask. If this is done in a situation with less than lethal chemicals in the air, enough exhaling will eventually clean the air in the mask, and you'll probably be okay. But in certain scenarios, like the spore-ridden areas in The Last of Us, putting the mask on after already entering the contaminated area doesn't make a whole lot of sense, as Joel is essentially just trapping a bunch of spores in the mask while putting it on, which of course exposes his lungs to that particular little cluster of spores. Again, if we're talking about tear gas or smoke, you could probably get away with that without breaking the realism too much, but if it's anything worse than that, putting the mask on needs to be done well before the hazardous air is encountered for it to really save anybody's life. In addition to that, different masks need to be used for different situations. Again, this is something that, upon just a small amount of scrutiny, should seem obvious, but nevertheless, games tend to treat masks as a one-mask-fits-all situation, and it's just not that way. While some masks that don't necessarily create an airtight seal might work out in burning buildings or even in a riot where tear gas is used, it's not going to go over well in a chlorine chemical attack. It's also true that a nice mask could be used for a variety of situations, but then you run into the problem of making sure you have the correct filters in place. Smoke, mustard gas, and some form of biological agent would all most likely require a different type of filter depending on the mask being used and what it's compatible with. Each of those categories can even have their own types within them. For instance, while sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide are both inorganic gases, the former is far more acidic than the latter, and as such would require a totally different type of filter to process it adequately. So, long story short, if you play a game with several different types of hazardous conditions where the character whips out the exact same gas mask every time, you're seeing an incorrect portrayal of how masks work. While it's true that all gas masks are not created equal, more importantly, however, is the fact that neither are their components. Intake filters vary in quality, size, and capability wildly, depending on where and how they're manufactured. The rate at which they need replaced can vary all over the map as well. On top of that, some masks that use a cheaper rubber material for the face can actually melt over time depending on what they're exposed to. This makes plenty of sense if you think about it. If a hazardous chemical could tear up your throat and lungs, why wouldn't it also wear out the mask over time? The replacement components and the degradation of the masks as a whole are virtually never reflected in games. Once you get a mask, you're good for the rest of the game. This is perhaps the most egregious falsehood that games portray about gas masks, and couldn't be further from the truth. In an era where firearm suppressors and melee weapons are often shown to wear out and become useless over time, to ensure a little more realism, surely we can also bring this mechanic to gas masks, as they are just as likely to degrade as anything else depending on the frequency of use. The last and perhaps most obvious thing we'll touch on that games get wrong about gas masks is how they're put on. Games usually see a character slap a mask on their face with about as much care as they slap a magazine into a gun. This is not how it's done, at least not if you want to do it correctly. Gas masks have to be cleaned and maintained well before being applied to the face, and often accompanied by a special chemical and flame-retardant cloth that is meant to go over top of them for added protection. Putting all of this on properly would, in reality, require the wearer to hold still for a minute or two and make sure everything is sealed and working properly before heading into a situation that could potentially end their lives. It's simply unrealistic to assume that somebody could just throw on a mask haphazardly before entering a room with lethal substances in the air, without checking the various latches and seals of the mask and applying all possible layers of protection beforehand. All that said, while gas masks are greatly oversimplified in video games and basically never get the nuance and detail applied to them that they do in real life, it's obvious to see why these details are glossed over. Unless the game you're making is titled Gas Mask Simulator, there's really not a lot to be gained from making the player fiddle around with all the small latches, materials, threads, filters, lenses, and so on, that all are needed to be kept in ideal condition and assembled perfectly for effective use. Why bog the player down in all of that when the game isn't really even about that? So, while it's easy to understand the simplification of gas masks in games, it's also important to remember that, like most types of equipment used in games, it just isn't that simple in real life. If you're ever in a situation where you need to use one, I just hope you're a lot more careful about it than video game characters are. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.